First of all, I'm very pleased to be here and to have the opportunity to continue a discussion that we began last year about this time in Berkeley, California. And I'm interested in your work, William, for all kinds of reasons. One of them has to do with the way in which political suffering is in the background and sometimes in the picture, and yet the art that you make is not reducible to a political message. It doesn't have a content that we could extract from the practice and the medium of the art, but it is there. So I have some questions about that, and I find myself very moved by that, because we are in the face of certain kinds of suffering. It's incontrovertible. You make it quite graphic, but in making it graphic, you make it something else, not in a counterfeit way and without promising a false transcendence. But you do show us what the material can do, or what the material has to say to us. And so I wanted to get to that question because it seems to me that there is, of course, loss and suffering throughout what you do. The history of South Africa, the political violence of South Africa, the personal losses that you have undergone or that others have undergone, they are there, but they are also transformed or worked with in some ways that I think would be interesting for us to talk about. But in order to understand that, I think there's a more basic issue, and it's one that I think philosophers or anyone interested in epistemology should consider, which is the role of the object or the material in thinking. Okay. You do not have an idea and impose it on some material. Whatever we might call an idea emerges in part through an interaction with material, and in part because the material is leading you somewhere. Here again, I'm not sure material is as good a word as it should be, but let's break it down a little bit. You write, for instance, about your training as a mime, something we've talked about before, and apparently William was trained as a mime here in Paris. Okay, so he has a Parisian pedigree that is important to note here. And you write that it was fundamental in thinking about the origin of a movement or gesture. It's the heart of it. What is needed, what is not needed, and learning to think through the body rather than thinking psychologically. So that's an interesting distinction right away. Thinking through the body, thinking psychologically. And then you say, allowing the body rather than the head to lead you in the studio means allowing a lot of leeway to your arm. Allowing a lot of leeway to your arm. I hope that translates, because it's not even simple in English. But letting your arm do what it must do effectively. I'm doing that now. I'm miming your mime, okay. Or giving a mime form to your thought, okay. Allowing the body rather than the head to lead you in the studio means allowing a lot of leeway to your arm, your hand. It means giving an image the benefit of the doubt. Giving an image the benefit of the doubt, seeing what the image means at the end. Seeing what the image means at the end. Now there's another place, I see you have a little clip that is being offered for people interested in attending the Slade lectures that you're giving in Oxford right now. And there you talk about thinking in cardboard, thinking in breath, and then you do something like, oh, right? In the clip, I was very impressed. Oh, okay, I'm going to think with you. I'm thinking in what? Oh my God. All right. All right, you mean it. Okay. Thinking in breath. Okay. One takes a fragment, it expands in one's head, and it makes its insistence felt, thinking in ink, charcoal, gesture. Okay. Can we talk about giving the image the benefit of the doubt? Can we talk about thinking in cardboard, thinking in breath, or letting the hand or the arm do what it must, effectively leading the way?
Okay, those are hard questions. And no, Judith, when you quote me back to myself, I kind of think, why did I write that? But let's take the most easy one, the arm. There are many artists who work just on a keyboard or on a computer, but I've always found that I need the physical activity of drawing. It's not simply an idea, an image fixes itself in one's head, and then you try to put it down better or less well. It's about physically being present in the studio. So that when you're making a drawing, it's very possible to start with a gesture that's the size of a body, that gives a kind of energy and a movement and a scale. And then you could say, no, I'm actually just going to draw from this. So that's from the belly or from the solar plexus, one might make it. Or you could say, I'm going to draw from the shoulder. So it's a drawing that is that size. We've gone from something that's like that to something. Or you can say, I'm going to draw with the elbow, or just with the hand, or just with the knuckles. And there's a very different kind of language of image that comes out, but also impulse behind it. And that for me, the danger is that you start with a gesture the size of a bodily gesture, and it ends up being so cautious that it's just finished with the knuckles. So how does one keep that energy all the way through? And one of the reasons for doing animation was that it's possible to say every drawing is provisional. Nothing has to get to the point of being finished with your knuckles. So that's one way of thinking in which the body changes and is a way of leading you. But also with ways of thinking, so that you can analyze a text. The way the sort of the Anglo-Saxon tradition of theatre is to take a text and analyze the psychology of the different actors. This is the prehistory. This is what they must have thought. This is what they've done. Or one can start saying, well, what is the energy of, let's perform this with a certain kind of energy. Is it a very relaxed energy? Mm-hmm. Is it a very neutral energy, a person going through it? Has it got an impulse? Does it have a passion? Is it so stiff, so much tension it can hardly move? And then if you put one actor together saying, I want you to keep where everything is a passion, and the other actor is always really relaxed, whatever the text is, you start having a psychology that comes out of that tension and a way of looking at the text, which very often is revelatory. Because in fact, to say, oh, it's an angry person, even angry people have moments of strange contradiction and relax. So that was a kind of a lesson rather than necessarily a technique to work on. Although working with actors, I do say, all right, do this in level 4, do this in level 2, and put them together that way. So it's a starting point. It may not be a finishing point. And when you watch it as an audience, you do see, you impose on it a kind of psychological understanding that comes out of the physicality. With ink, for example, you can have a very good brush which has got a fine point, and a good Chinese brush that keeps its point. If you clean it well and you do it well, and every mark corresponds to either a fat mark or to a fine mark. But you also find after a while that your brushes misbehave. Instead of having a beautiful point, the edges splay out, and you can only get a really ugly, messy mark. But then you discover what that suggests if you touch it down, is a kind of, it's frustrating because you can't control it, but the very lack of control sometimes means you can arrive at a foliage by the almost random marks that these, so it leads you towards an idea of foliage, of multiplicity. With the charcoal animation, because you can't do a perfect erasure, the medium won't allow you to do a perfect erasure. There'll always be a trace of grey from what you have erased. Whether you like it or not, in the paper, in the medium itself, there's a trace of a movement. If you're doing successive drawings of a hand moving through space, you don't just see the final drawing here, you see a trace of the drawing in its different stages. So what the medium suggests here, even thematically, is one of turning time into something solid, but also keeping a trace of things. So it brings memory in as a theme. It brings the fragility and the need to look for traces of objects to understand. So those are just ways in which it's not as clear as thinking in cardboard, but it is being led by the meeting between an impulse and what the image throws towards you.
Do you think we could see clip number 6? And I think that might be pertinent to what we're talking about.
I can find number 6. Where are we here? Tell me if this is the right clip. Not this one? Which one do you want?
The one where you're doubled and you're...
Oh, where I'm doubled?
Yeah.
Okay. Ah, yes. This is just it's a short extract from a series of films that were made in the studio during lockdown, during the COVID lockdown, about life in the studio. Do it like this, it's fine. It's okay. It's fine. That's fine. Oh, okay. A presentation. Great. Can you remember Mom's face? Yes, of course I remember Mom's face. How could you forget? I mean, it's now 4 years, it was 5 years ago. How could you forget? You know, sometimes I think I'll just concentrate and remember what her face was, and then it won't form. Let me explain how memory works. You have the sensation that comes into your eye, and what it does is it increases the energy, so there's a little spark. And if you see it again, then there's another spark and a new neuron grows, like a little sprig of branches that come out with each vision, with each impulse that comes. Growing different branches and twigs, so that as an image becomes familiar, you build up this network, this branching tree of neurons connecting, growing. Each time there's a sensory impulse, a new set of neurons grows, and that becomes the memory. So the tree that is all these different branches of fragments that have been pushed forward by the energy of what your eyes have seen, what you've heard, that becomes the memory map of Mom. So in the end, the collection of new synapses and twigs and branches should be a portrait of Mom. But I call her face up, and then instead of seeing that tree, a different tree entirely appears. Maybe it's the teacher I had in Standard 2, or some other person who I can't quite place. And even if I can't bring up the image of Mom, sometimes it's just her eyes or her mouth, as if she gets fractured into all these different sections of different plants which float away from each other, which won't hold their coherence. I know, it's hard. Sometimes she appears in a dream, but often she keeps her distance.
Well, first of all, thank you for that. I'm struck, first of all, by the fact that there's a pedagogical aim in this presentation, how memory works. I will show you. And that's
I wouldn't
great.
trust it.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, we're your students.
Okay.
At that moment, we're also your double, because you're speaking to your double, but you're speaking to us, and we understand our role. And of course, the minute you start drawing, it's not a demonstration that will then serve as an example of how memory works or give us a window onto memory. It is the working of memory. In other words, it is the drawing is the working of memory. This is the work of memory. And of course, it's representational, but it's not the representation we're expecting. But we also come to accept that the branches, the twigs, all of both of which are linked to the picture of the mother, which barely appears. But what we learn, I think, is that there's an interlocking network, or they're branching trees and new neurons, right? So one thing begets another. We're in a chain of associations, or one might say a metonymic chain, where there are transpositions and substitutions taking place, none of which efface the mother, by the way, or efface the loss, right? This is not, again, it's not, oh, here's a clear representation of what I mean to say. It's rather, this is what happens to drawing, when this is what is being said, or is we are called upon to say, or something calls upon us to say. And so that neuron map, as you would call it, or that set of trees, one of which calls up another, seemed to me to be the portrait of the mother, the lost mother. And there's a beauty in it, as well as a difficulty, because we're not exactly recovering something lost. We are allowing the experience of loss to elaborate a set of connections. And this is where I always see this subtle optimism in your work. Where it comes from is, of course, very interesting, because it's as if the moment you start to draw whatever you're drawing with, let's say charcoal, I know that's very important to you, the charcoal then takes you somewhere, or the first set of images takes you somewhere, or pulls you along, or your encounter with the charcoal produces something somewhat unexpected, but not, it's not a distraction, exactly. It's an elaboration. And I think also whoever she is, when you refer to her, she keeps her distance. You know, she has to come to you or not come to you. Sometimes she comes in a form, maybe she doesn't come. And then it seems like it's all over, and then there's that sound of the shoes, which is the ultimate sound, right? It's like, oh my God, I remember it well. My mother's home, I can hear the shoes on the floor.
It's I mean, there are a couple of different things there. There's one which is, has to do, this is a series, there are many series of trees drawn, which in some way are connected to either self-portraits or other portraits, people as trees. But there's also something about what you were talking about. Where does one find one's comfort? And I realized at some point, maybe 2 decades into working in the studio, drawing in the studio, the essential nature of the studio in terms of the way I realized what a place of comfort it was, the activity of drawing was to myself. In a state of great distress, I found after some hours in the studio, somehow it was lifting that. Not that I was drawing the distress, I wasn't drawing any images of what it was that was upsetting me, but somehow there was something in that activity, in that conversation between the arm and the sheet of the paper and the eye, that maybe it's just about a habit of activity, felt enormously calming and comforting. So I understood, okay, that's one of the levels at which it works internally for the person making it. Doesn't mean it works that way for people receiving it. But the way in which I suppose the trees can take on that attribute of not only being a tree. They're not very good trees. Most of them are fairly inaccurate trees. But
They all have great arms, though.
well, generally, yeah, they're all trees. I mean, there's a possibility of. I'm always intrigued in the way artists have drawn the multiplicity of foliage, of which there are millions of leaves, but they have to be rendered even in the most realistic drawings with relatively few gestures. And so the way in which Renaissance artists drew foliage, the way Rembrandt drew foliage, the way Courbet paints foliage, the way that a brush mark close-up is a piece of green paint, but as you step back it becomes irresistibly a leaf or foliage. So those kind of historical conversations with ways in which trees are done is one of the things that if you're working in them you can't resist. They're there. They're part of what makes one's eye. And in that the bad brush was a key in doing it. So generally they're not drawings of European deciduous trees. They're of kind of South African trees around Johannesburg and the Bushveld, which are generally quite spiky and thorns and some foliage, but not the great lushness of the forests of Northern Europe.
Yes.
And so in that sense, they also become a kind of a localized image.
Yes.
But I do go around hunting for trees when I'm around Johannesburg or in the Bushveld or around there.
Yeah. I'm tempted to say, I mean, you talked, I've heard you talk before about the problem of keeping art as a collaborative activity during the pandemic. People were locked into separate spaces, and there you are in your studio, and you produce company for yourself. Very impressive. But in fact, you were also working collaboratively with a group of artists in Johannesburg, if I'm not mistaken, and that somehow you were able to keep the atelier alive under safe conditions. But I think if I'm right, and this is a stretch, but we'll try it. If I'm right, collaboration is not just among humans. You're also collaborating with your materials. In other words, if the chalk or the arm is going to take you someplace, you are collaborating with parts of your body or with materials you're working with. They have, I don't want to say they have a mind of their own. I think that would be overstating. But they are pushing and pulling you in certain ways that you have to respond to. You're not just a unilateral maker.
No. So to talk about charcoal, because it is. I used to get fantastic pieces of charcoal that were kind of the thickness of one's wrist from an art supply shop in Florence. And then at a certain point, they stopped having it. I later discovered that charcoal was a byproduct of making various cadmium pigments, but the European community had decided that cadmium was carcinogenic, and so production had been stopped, and so there was no more charcoal. And for several years, I suffered under not finding that charcoal and stopped doing a kind of drawing. And one of the things about the charcoal, because it's so blunt, it's not a sharpened point of a pencil, so you would draw with it, And somehow you had to rely that between your hand and this blunt, inanimate object, it would know where it's going to hit the sheet of paper. And you would kind of take your chance moving quickly and hope that the marks it hit were in the right place for 2 eyes and a nose and a mouth, and that the eye weren't put there and there because that's where the charcoal hit.
Yes.
And then many years later, a young artist in Johannesburg sent me a box of charcoal and said he'd started making charcoal and could that work? And that, for the first time in maybe 15 years, had the same blackness and thickness and indeterminacy of its point. And that was important. It was important about coming back to a certain kind of charcoal drawing after a gap. There'd been a lot of ink painting in between, and it was partly because the charcoal was not. And I think that, so there is collaboration, as you say, with a lot of performers, musicians. It doesn't help to have a collaborator making drawings, but performing, music, editing, all of those things which are part of much of the other work are very much collaboration in the sense that they're not simply carrying out my instructions.
Yes.
It's me also seeing what things they suggest, what things are made, and having a strong agency in what is done. So I'm not sure if a piece of charcoal can have agency.
Okay, that's, I suppose, the big question.
But
I mean, because there are now people out there who are making a strong case for objects having agency.
Well, it certainly has a strong position, and insofar as it changes what I do, maybe that has agency. But can you have agency without volition?
Okay.
In other words, does the charcoal want it to go somewhere, or that's where it knows it goes without wanting it?
But when you find yourself going a certain direction in response to what the arm is doing or the charcoal is doing, are you volitional?
Well, it's caught. It's not random, and it's not planned. So it has to be something in the world between planning it out in advance, and it's not aleatoric, saying let's pick up random texts, random words out of a book and see what the text becomes.
Right.
It's not kind of that surrealist project.
Right.
It's saying let's take random words out of a book, put them on a table, and then see what sort of things they suggest, and then adjust and direct them. So it's and the same sort of thing I would say with the charcoal.
Okay. Okay. Do you think we could see clip 2? It gives us a way to talk about landscape and political background or political foreground.
Yes. This one?
Oh, let's do that one, yes.
Okay.
That's an amazing one.
Okay, so just to give the background, this is a series of extracts from a film made in 1994. 1994 was the year of the first democratic election in South Africa. And just prior to this election, in a couple of years, there was virtually a civil war in South Africa between different political factions. And huge numbers of people, relatively huge numbers of people, many hundreds, maybe a few thousand people died. And in the celebrations after that election, in that miraculous transformation that was done, I had a sense of how will these be remembered, these deaths be remembered. And so it was partly that image. And then there's a second connection to which we can talk about afterwards, talking about how does childhood come into the images one makes.
Yes.
But should we first show it?
Yes, please.
think I'd seen the film, it must have been 1994, I'm not sure when Shoah came out, 1980s, the Claude Lanzmann film, the Shoah.
It was about 89, 90, I believe.
Something like that. So I'd seen it relatively recently. And one of the things that struck me so forcefully in the film was some of the landscapes, Polish landscapes. And there would be the image would show you a line of trees or a forest, the randomness of trees, and then suddenly there'd be a section where you could see the trees were planted in lines, and then they'd go on again with random plantings. And the shocking thing was to understand, the fact that the trees were in lines rather than randomly was the only trace that there'd been a massacre at that point.
I see.
And so when they'd covered over the graves, the mass graves, trees had been planted. So there was a way in which the landscape hid its history, and one had to look for traces of that to understand. And so that struck me, that sense of the fickleness of memory, things that one should hang on to, should remember so strongly, that start to dissolve. And it's about nature losing its memory or effacing its history, not just as a human thing. In fact, using the natural phenomenon as a metaphor for the human one. A second, connection to those drawings, which I realized long after I'd made the film, was a memory. These were based on police forensic photographs of people who had been killed in that era. But when I was 5 years old, there was a massacre in South Africa. Police shot 69 people dead in Sharpeville who were protesting. And my father, a lawyer, was a lawyer for the family at the inquest into this shooting. And as a 5 or 6 year old, I came across by chance in his office a box which I thought had a box of chocolates, but in fact was a box of photographs, forensic photographs.
Okay.
So it was about the shock of seeing those. And I'd forgotten about them. I hadn't forgotten the photos, but it was long after this film was finished that I actually thought, okay, that's what my arm was, that's what was being made. It was both about the immediate history, but it was also so full of those. What was it that said you need to draw these bodies lying on the ground where they have? So obviously one can't test exactly how much is the old history and how much is but both are certainly present in it when I look at it.
Yes. I was kind of interested in, many aspects of this. It's so condensed and powerful. But the place of the page, for instance, it looks like maybe that's newspaper. A lot of the people who had, that's also just a kind of piece of naturalism. There were people who some were covered with a blanket, some were entirely uncovered, and there were several that were covered with sheets of newspaper. I see.
So that was a kind of and I thought, okay, paper, I can make paper move. I know how to animate a sheet of paper floating in the air. So it's a mixture always in the drawings of the outside world meeting the drawing halfway. What things suggest themselves graphically as drawings, and also what are the things that carry an emotional weight you want to pursue.
Yes. And the spikes that come down from somewhere.
Yeah, the spikes are kind of like surveyor's beacons, I think.
Well, it does seem like you're mapping something.
It's mapping, but it's also less intelligent. So, in the sense of this way, to describe it this way. There are some people who spend 5 years making a 5-minute film, working extremely carefully, and that would drive me crazy. So there's a part of me that feels the film needs to be moving. There's an urgency. And so I would spend a day doing a drawing, 2 days doing a drawing, one of these landscapes, one of these figures. And I think, but we're just going to look at it for 2 seconds. I spent all this time and we've seen the image, okay, it's got to move on. And there's a difference in time. If you have a static photograph or a drawing and you look at it, then the time is your time. I'm giving this drawing 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds.
Yes.
But as soon as there's some movement in that image. The time goes into the image. A bird flies across, and it's not you looking at the image for 5 seconds, it's 5 seconds of a bird flying across a landscape. And so to some extent, those beams that come down are there almost like clocks putting time into the image. And it means at the end of the day, those are quite quick to do compared to the other drawings. Oh, I've got 10 seconds of film. So part of it is as stupid as that.
Well,
That's the part.
it's not stupid. It's part of the constraint of making. But I did. I wondered because it looked, of course, like newspaper, and I didn't realize that there was, in fact, this practice of trying to cover the body with something, a kind of Antigone-like heroics. There's got to be something to cover this body with. But how ironic that it would be newspaper, which is either reporting or failing to report the atrocities of the time. At the same time, it's very often a blank page. And I know the blank page functions for you in different work, suggesting that it may be a canvas or it may be a page on which something is yet to be written. It was unclear. And then, of course, there's a lyrical song that starts midway through, or a little past midway through. And who is that? Who is singing? And is that a sorrow song? I don't know.
It's kind of I mean, these are different clips from different parts of the film. So it's not a coherent
I
piece.
see. Okay.
It's the woman that you see at the end who is lying on the ground, turns into the landscape, is a figure that goes through the film.
I see.
And you don't see her singing, but in a sense it's her lament that takes us through. And it's one of the elements of the soundtrack, an important, vital one.
Yes. I also, had a sense that maybe those spikes were marking something, but they were kind of pitiful monuments. They were brutal monuments. And I wondered whether you understood yourself to be, or whether you saw in this work something like an edifice being built, or a changing landscape that continued to carry elements of what was lost.
I mean, insofar as they're surveyors' beacons, they're saying, here something happened.
Yes.
Even if the specific of it is lost in the landscape. So they act as markers. Sometimes they're red marks that make things. Sometimes they're these. In this film, there are lines that come down. In many others, they are. I suppose it's saying the landscape is a landscape, but there are all sorts of hidden histories.
Hidden histories
in it, which, as we know, there's so many different stories of empty landscapes which people take over. In South Africa, the early colonial paintings of this empty, virgin, Edenic landscape.
Yes.
There for the taking. So it's saying it's not an innocent landscape in a way.
There's a brief excerpt from Kaboom that you also have. I have it down as clip 4, perhaps. And I think it also raises this question of a kind of political background that becomes landscape, or that riddles the landscape with its untold stories.
So the waterfall.
Yes, it's the head on the earth, the bowl.
No, let's get the...
Do I have it wrong?
No, I'm not sure. There's a landscape. This one?
Well, there's that one.
That's a kind of the same as what we've seen.
Yeah, we can also see that one. I love that one.
Okay, we can.
I mean, one question I have, well, I'll raise it after.
That's in fact the head of Jericho. That's in a painting of Jericho. But I don't think this is the clip you wanted to see.
That's okay. I have a question about it.
They are not men because they have no name. They are not soldiers because they have no number. You don't call them, you count them.
You don't call them, you count them, right, at the end.
This is a reference, this is an extract from a theatre production about African carriers in the First World War. And it was a writing of a French officer. They're not soldiers because they have no name. You don't count them. You don't call them, you count them.
Yes.
They turn into numbers. They dissolve. People turning into numbers.
Right. So, one of the questions I have, I mean, I've asked you this before, whether you feel like you are in a process of archiving something. Are you telling a history? Are you preserving a history? Are you trying to discover that which is not archived or that which is not archivable? Okay, that would be one question. And then the other question I have is there always a photograph in the that is not here? is the photograph or the place of photography in the making of archives, especially archives of war or atrocity, is that in the deep background, or it maybe or maybe even as an inverse of the drawings? Do you have a relationship with the non-photograph?
I mean, there are some images which are based, the one head was based on a Jericho. It's a kind of a quotation of a French head, guillotine French head. But there are others in terms of the archive. So to give an easy example, there are millions, I mean, you see it here in the corridor of the École Normale, a list of people who died from the school in the First World War, in the Second World War. In every village in Britain, and I'm sure in France, there's a list, a cenotaph with the names of those who died. But there are very few lists of names of the million Africa. There are approximately 1 million people in Africa who died during the First World War. And there are the names of people who drowned in a particular capsizing of a ship in South Africa. But of the 200,000 porters, of the 1,800,000 civilians that died, there's no record. And so when there are lists of names in the work, it's a kind of a negative, it's about what's not there.
Yeah.
Standing in, obviously it's not an accurate record of the names which are not known, but it's names that from the regions where people. Maybe I can show a clip with those names.
Yeah.
So it's very much about gaps in the archive. For example, in Namibia, next to South Africa, where there was one of the first genocides the first genocide of the 20th century of Herero people by the German colonialists. I mean, Namibia has been independent for 30 years. But the only monument to this genocide is a statue of a German soldier which is still up. And that is so in terms of gaps of history, even when it's not, you're still under a colonial control, so you can't say what you like, even still, there's this enormous gap.
Well, they're still waiting for the Germans to apologize for that genocide, if I'm not mistaken.
I think
Maybe it'll come down. Yeah. Maybe it'll come down then.
But so they're kind of stand-in for an archive. So let's.
Okay.
No, not that one. No, sorry. No, you've done this one before. It's gone.
Oh, it's gone.
Maybe it's at the end of this one. I'll jump through this clip. Okay, we can play this
and see.
and see.
truth.
Amathemba ayishumi nanye.
We had to move a boat from Cape Town to Lake Tanganyika.
Kwathi emva kwezinsuku ezimbili
The engineers took the boat apart.
kwase kusele amathemba amathathu.
First, it was carried on a train.
Aphela amaphupho.
When the train line ended, it was pulled by a tractor.
Aphela amathemba.
When the road defeated the tractor,
Ashabalala amathemba.
it was put on the backs of oxen.
Ashabalala amaphupho.
When the tsetse fly killed all the oxen, it was put on the backs of men.
Bacabanga ukuthi sizofa.
They hope we will die and not return home.
Kodwa angeke sikwenze lokho.
That I will not do.
Sizobuyela emagcekeni wakomthaniya.
But we will go back home
Buka sesinethezeka emabeleni omakoti bethu.
to enjoy the company of beautiful women.
For every soldier, 3 carriers. For every officer, 9 carriers. For every machine gun, 12 carriers. For every cannon, 300 carriers. If a man dies, another remains. If 100 die, 100 remain. If 1,000 die, another 1,000 carry the boat to the lake.
Okay. Okay, that's okay. I thought that one was actually quite amazing.
When we did it,
Yeah.
there was a real question. It's obviously about what histories are remembered, what things disappear. It's based on an engraving, a 19th century engraving of the African trade in slaves, enslaved people. And we tried it forwards and backwards. In other words, if one starts with an empty landscape and you say this was the history of the landscape, or you say this is the image and the image is removed. And in the end, I think we went with it backwards, but it was intriguing to try it. It wasn't clearly right or wrong either way, but this is the way it ended up.
It's also a clip about about the regeneration of a struggle. They can deprive us of everything. They can take our lives, but we will regenerate, right? And we hear some of that language in Palestine today, and I also think there is a regenerative dimension of your own work, which we might say functions at an aesthetic level, but resonates at a political level. In other words, you're not someone who will say, given the atrocities of the world, there can be no art. You will, in some sense, say, given the atrocities of the world, there will be art, but there is a struggle with that history and its traces that will form the inevitable difficulty and problem for that art, if I may say. I mean, you're not a self-referential modernist who, as much as you love your forms and you love your materials, it's not. It can never be a fully self-referential activity for you. Although you take your forms and materials quite seriously, but as perhaps. I don't know if I would call them regenerative or optimistic or transformative, but those words do come to mind even when you are working with the legacy of atrocities that we would tend to call unspeakable. There are sort of two issues I'd like to raise before we open up our conversation. And one of them has to do with your relationship to the formalism of modernism, which is kind of there and also something that you move beyond in some interesting ways. And then the second has to do with what we expect of collaborative artistic practices now, what they not only promise, what can they produce, but what is the practice of collaboration as a social value? In other words, what is being enacted when you collaborate? What world is being brought into being or configured? But let me do the first. In a published conversation, you remarked, and I loved this, that Cézanne had this idea of reducing the physical world as an artist into basic forms, into the sphere, the cylinder, and the cone. And so art from Cézanne onwards, for many decades, was about this kind of reductive form of taking the world and simplifying it onto the page. I, at a certain point, and this had to do with growing up in South Africa, where formalism kept on bumping up against the world around us, said, well, what if we take those forms of Cézanne and put them back out into the world and send them to work? So the cone, which he described, became very simple, became the megaphone that's in many, many works. And the sphere that he described becomes a sphere back in the world. In other words, it becomes a planet, it becomes the world itself. So in a way, the image of the world on its hind legs is a way of putting that tradition of modernism back into a different context. And there is something about, as soon as you put a pair of dividers next to anything or a pair of scissors, you immediately have a set of walking legs. There's a kind of irresistible anthropomorphism we have, in this case, turning the sphere into a walking object. Now, I would say this is neither formalism, nor is it realism, nor is it particularly postmodern, whatever that means. It's an insult that always gets hurled at me. I never know what is being said. But in any case, it's an offshoot from a certain kind of modernist preoccupation with form, but refusing to be reduced to formalism, right? You never give up form, but you definitely give up formalism.
Well, to race through a history quickly.
Yes.
In South Africa in the 1970s, when I was a student, to be an artist was to paint with oil paint on canvas. And there was a received history of modernism that went from the Impressionists to the Post-Impressionists to the Fauves, and from the Fauves it kind of to Matisse, and after Matisse it jumped across the Atlantic to New York, where it became abstract expressionism, then American color field painting, and ended up with the Pope, Clement Greenberg, who said that art was about edge and surface, the touch of it, and was not concerned with things outside. And in South Africa, that seemed impossible. We were in the middle of political turmoil.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, to go back to, and there was something about the energy of the abstract expressionists, of Matisse painting, of the Fauves, that could not be denied. So how did one find an art that didn't become academic, but that was still connected to the world? And so for that, I looked in different places. So Max Beckmann, as one kind of the Neue Sachlichkeit of Germany, as a kind of way of connecting to the world, but not being a 19th century academic way of making art. And so those became really important. How does one hang on to the world, but still understand the extraordinary leaps that non-representational ways of working had become? So that continued, and the way of putting Cézanne back into the world was as you described. There's something very satisfactory about the cone shape, both as a magnification of sound, as a graphic device. One thinks of L. Lissitzky, let the red wedge divide the white circle, the Rodchenko photo of Lily Brick with her big megaphone. So there are many, one finds an alternative trajectory of images. And then the other thing to talk about, collaboration, the nature of it.
Yeah.
Again, to give it South African context. I mean, growing up in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s was at the height of apartheid. So the school I went to was an all-boys, all-white school. The university I went to, by law, had to be white students, and there were other universities for black students. There were a scattering of black students, but essentially it was an all-white university. But at university, we started working with a theatre company, first just of white students, and then joining forces with a theatre company mainly or largely made up of people who were employed at the university as cleaners, as librarians, as clerks who had a theatre group. And what that meant, there was a kind of small utopian space. I mean, I say the utopian space was the working space while we were making and collaborating, improvising and making the pieces of theatre. Every evening when that work had finished, the white students would go back to the white suburbs and different degrees of comfort, and the black workers at the university would go back 20 kilometers to Soweto, where they had to live to different degrees of poverty. But in that moment of actually working together, there were two things. There was both a discovering of each other's worlds and also a kind of a metaphoric saying, this is what it could be like. There was no illusion that this is actually we were making a new world. In that protected space of the theatre studio, it existed.
Yes.
And that was kind of vital. And that's why the great theatre works of South Africa in the 1970s and 80s came through this form and through the fact of being able to do a kind of meeting and gathering that was not possible in other spheres in life.
But you were experimenting with a new world.
So experimenting with a new way of what it would be, of saying our voice or your own thought is not all there is in the world. There are other voices and other understandings, other pieces, and that still continues in the work I do. The collaborators bring, and we all bring, very different things to it that is so much more than just the individual sections.
And it seems to me that you've only added more sorts of media to your work, right? So you're now doing opera. These are films or moving images in one way or another. Very often we see drawings linked with films, with theater, with opera, and there's some singing going on and there's some movement going on. I mean, you work across several media now. Is that part of an idea of collaboration? Is that part of do you widen your circle by doing that? Or does
it does widen it, but that wasn't the idea. It was, when I started out, I was doing theatre with the university students and other people, and I was also doing my academic studies, and I was at an art school in the evening. And friends gave me good advice. They said, this is ridiculous. If you want to make drawings, focus on making drawings. If you're going to do theatre, do theatre. If you want to be thinking, then do that. Don't think you can do them all. You're just going to become a jack of all trades. And I thought, okay, that's very good advice. So I sold my etching press, I closed the studio, and came to Paris to become an actor at the theatre school, and discovered after 3 weeks I was not an actor. So eventually I ended up back making drawings, and then I discovered I could animate those drawings. So that started. At first I thought, okay, that's not my work. My work is drawings. I'm just making drawings. And then I found that those animated films came into theatre productions. And then I finally gave up and went back to doing everything. But it took me a long time. It took many years to undo that good advice.
I see.
And it was also a long period where I thought, okay, I'm doing this till I find out what I'm really going to do when I get a real job. Until a friend said to me, you're now 30, you've never had a job. You are unemployable. No one will give you a job. Either sink or swim with this drawing that you're doing, but stop making a fuss about doing anything.
Yes.
So there are different moments of advice or non-advice which shape who one is.
Yes. No, my parents wanted me to be a lawyer, and
Kind of lawyer.
I
You're a
am.
kind of
It's
lawyer.
true, but they wanted me to produce something useful in the world. Well, I don't know. They thought I wouldn't make a living without that, but I did okay.
But it's interesting that, because on the one hand, yes, it's not what they said, but in a different way, it's exactly what they said.
Yes.
Making a living from thinking hard about right and wrong and how one should go through the world.
Yes. True.
I mean, I had a lawyer parents that
Yes,
didn't
you
want me
did.
to be a lawyer. And I think I became an artist as a resistance to that.
Yes.
Because there was always, my father, who's a very good lawyer, would always be able to demolish any argument with one or two questions of cross-examination.
Oh, terrible. Okay.
So there
I
was
hope I'm
his
not
opinion.
doing that. I
No,
hope I'm
so
not
there
doing
was
that.
there was his opinion that was too strong. So I think I decided I had to find a way of finding my own opinion in a way that was could resist any cross-examination.
I see.
You can't literally rationally ask, why is the sky painted green? That's just the
No.
way the painting is. It's
Yes, you were able to move away
to
from
move
that.
away from that.
Yes.
But in the strange way, come back to some of their same questions they would have had.
I see. Well, I think I couldn't be a lawyer because it would bring out the absolute worst part of me. Because I would always win.
Okay, so I couldn't become a lawyer because if I couldn't find the right argument or the right piece of evidence, I would invent it. So I thought, I need to find a profession in which invention is celebrated rather than a cause for punishment and rustication and being disbarred.
Yes. But you
You
were.
would always win.
Yes,
You would always win.
But yeah, well, that was my conceit. So you can imagine how monstrous I would be if I didn't win. But you grew up with all of this legal work happening around you, and then you experienced the dissolution of apartheid, and so that legal world, the new constitution, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are all happening as you're working. So you're in a proximity to massive legal disruption and change, even as you're not entering the legal discourse, right?
I mean, certainly it was, yes, it was certainly around, and I have a sister-in-law who's a lawyer, my daughter's a lawyer, so the law continued around, and
Yes.
obviously my parents were both very much involved in the big legal questions or the legal opposition to what was happening in South Africa.
Yes.
So it was very, in that sense, it was a fortunate childhood for a white Johannesburg boy,
Yes.
in the sense of being aware very early on of the disjunction, of the illogic, of the absurdity, of the evil absurdity of what apartheid was. Absurdity, not in the sense of the joke, but in the sense of a logic that's gone awry. Let's construct the world on the basis of someone's skin color and follow that through to the nth degree where it becomes an absurdity. Your life will be dependent on whether we can stick a pencil in your hair and it will
Yes.
stay there.
Yes. Okay. I'm finding, and I'll just end my remark with this. Maybe two things. One, it was important for me not to go around the world prosecuting or just fighting the good fight all the time, because there's then no room or time to ask some other kinds of questions about how we're organizing the world, or where we do find reprieve, or what kinds of possibilities of transformation there might be. There's always transformation through the law, but I always thought the legal framework was a restrictive way of understanding transformation, necessary, but restrictive. So I'm really glad I have the new rights that I have as a gay person, or whatever it is. And I struggle for those, and I fight. But, and we still have, and those fundamental rights for lesbian, gay, trans people are under attack, right now. And so we do need to speak up, and we need to speak the language of rights, and we need to speak about constitutional issues and things like that. But, there are fundamental questions, say, about sexuality or gender or race or the way the world is organized economically that the law can't explain. In other words, it can help us, but it's not a good descriptive vocabulary for the enigmas of our lives and the question of how we grieve or how we move forward or how we come to acknowledge the deep injustices, right? We can name an injustice in the law, but that's not the same as working out a set of working out in the sense that grief is a kind of working out what has happened, and to come to know a history in a bodily way, and to continue to make it or remake it as one lives. And also, how does one move forward after a great loss? You know, this is a massive question for so many people these days, and I do think that you approach that question, whether it's from South Africa or from other parts of history, or indeed from the Holocaust against the Jews. I think, you know, there are many ways that the question of how one moves forward gets posed. And I don't think you give us any prescriptions, and I'm very grateful to you for that, right? Because then you would become a politician, and we need you to stay an artist. But even when some of those white papers fly off, you know, there are just some moments where those white papers fly off, right? There's something, we don't know what direction they're going in. We don't know whether something will be written on them or drawn on them. They are kind of flying canvases into an unknown space, into an unknown future, which is a kind of figure for the future of some kind of art, if you don't mind my saying. And I'm grateful to you, because when you do that, it's not a false transcendence, and it's not an effacement. It's rather in and through this history of effacement, where no good monument has ever been built or could be built. How do we mark the traces of those losses and move forward with the materials that are at our disposal or called to us or move us in some way? How do we enter into some kind of transformative interaction with something we have not fully made, but which is part of the making? And, you know, I find that to be very inspirational. I think as well that for academics like me and maybe many people here, you know, we're faced with a new question of how do we speak more broadly to the world, bring what we have to offer to public contexts. And one reason I'm happy to be working with arts institutions at this time is that I never know what kind of background people have. I don't assume they have the same formation that I do. I don't even assume we share a theoretical vocabulary, but it allows me to speak in a way that maybe goes back to the rudiments and finds a site of connection with others I can't fully know or I can't fully see. Anyway, I think we could open this up to a couple questions if we have some time, and I don't know if you'd like to add anything to my little sermon. That was a little sermon.
It all sounded, struck a chord. No, no, it wasn't.
Thank you both so much. I'm going to introduce two respondents who are part of the doctoral SACRe program, who will ask a couple of questions for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. So first, let me introduce Richard Dumy, who is a theatre performer and director, as well as a drag artist, currently in his first year in the SACRe doctoral program at Conservatoire National Supérieur d'Art Dramatique, the National Theatre School. And his PhD project is called Images in Which the Future Can Be Lived, Gender Performance on Theatre Stages as a Site for New Possibilities of Incarnation and New Narratives. So this practice-based PhD will explore how gender studies and queer politics can inform practices of acting as well as pedagogy in the performing arts. And Célia Boutillier, who's sitting next to him, is an artist and photographer currently pursuing a PhD at Beaux-Arts de Paris as part of the SACRe program. Now in its third year, her PhD project is called Imaginal Photography for a Symbiotic Aesthetic, It is led in collaboration with a research team at Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle. She questions the role of images in the construction of our knowledge of the world and is interested in interrelations between species and forms of hybridity, which she explores visually, notably through operations of collage and montage. So the floor is yours.
First, I would like to thank everyone that helped organize the event and for giving us the chance to discuss a little bit with you. And thank you to you both to take this time to answer our questions. To give a little bit of context to my questions, I have to say that I speak from the perspective of an actor, a director, and a drag queen. 3 practices in which we tell stories through our bodies, in which we represent different kinds of life. And in these practices, I am often confronted with the idea of an ethics of representation. How can I play the other? How can I tell a story that it is not my own? How can I create representations without plainly repeating schemes of oppression? And I found similar concerns in your book, Judith, Frames of War, When is Life Grievable? When you say that the critique of violence must begin with the question of the representability of life itself. And you ask, what allows a life to become visible in its precariousness and its need for shelter? You ask, what is it that keeps us from seeing or understanding certain lives in this way? And you explain that the frames of representations that we unfold are setting apart lives that are seen as grievable, as lives worth living, from the one that are seen as ungrievable and not worth living, not perceived as life. And what I draw from this book and from this excerpt is that we, as artists, have an ethical duty in the kind of representations we put out in the world. We have a duty not to repeat the same representations we were given, representation which exclude many lives, deeming them as ungrievable and as lives that are not worth living. We have a part to play in shifting those narratives. My question is, how would you both describe this part we artists have to play? How can we shift those narratives in our art in effective way? And a second question follows. We often witness ungrievable lives, such as refugees or trans people, being used as storylines in movies or theater plays because these are what I would call emotional topics. During a short period of time, those stories move people, but it doesn't last long. And I sometimes feel that those stories are used in a way that comfort the viewers in their so-called humanity, but do not shift the frames in which they perceive these lives. How can we create representations that convey meaningful shifts in our frames of perception without turning these lives into emotional products to consume and to be consumed? Here.
I know you do. Well, thank you. I mean, I think, boy, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think one of the reasons that I enjoy and maybe even require Kentridge's work is that it allows me to feel a range of things about histories that I know something about, but I come to know them in a different way through this work. At the same time, I see that it's really important as a person with a certain kind of privilege or power, not to be paralyzed in the face of a history of suffering that other people have gone through. So then the question is, how do I relate to that history of suffering? Or how do we work with it in art or even in our writings? Not to appropriate it, but also not to make the opposite error, which is to paralyze ourselves with a kind of guilt, like I can't speak on that topic. I can't acknowledge that loss. I can't tell that history. It's like, no. it's really important that you tell that history and that you know that history and that you include it and that you try to work with it. And you work with people, like in the atelier, you work with people who will keep your perspective moving and informed and produce new forms of collaboration that are based on notions of equality or reciprocity, which are principles that we'd like to see informing a broader social and political world. So I think one reason I was kind of pressing on collaboration here as well is that we do get changed by working with other people and getting their perspectives. So if I were to do something with a minority community to which I don't belong, you know, I would work with them in some way to find out what place I can have that both acknowledges something but doesn't appropriate it. I think what I get a little worried about these days, and I don't know how much of this is happening here, but people say, oh, I'm white and privileged, so I can't speak. It's like, I don't think so. That's not a responsible use of your power, right? We have to use our power. We have to use it responsibly. Having power is not bad. Using power irresponsibly is problematic. So I don't know. That's just my initial thought on that.
Yes. I think you have to understand that a condition of being an artist is partly a condition of being a hyena. That you take things and you use them and you find fragments that speak to you, and one is fed that way. And so that's one element. That's raw material. But in the end, fundamentally, if it has to do with the sensitivity, with the nature of the writer or the artist or the filmmaker, as to whether it is abusive, if it's not abusive, if it's pretentious, if it claims to be things it is not. In the end, the work that you do is always about oneself, reveals who you are. But to try to anticipate that necessarily in advance, to stop yourself in case you get it wrong. If you're going to get it wrong, you will get it wrong, however careful you are. Not to say you will get it right necessarily at all, but one has to have confidence in the impulses you have, in the good faith with which you work. Bad faith usually shows itself. So if you're doing a subject because it's hot at the moment, or you think it's an important topic, but it doesn't come from somewhere else. But the idea that you can only connect to your own world, that always seems to me very false. In a very broad way, a lot of the best understandings of different worlds have come from people from outside that context, where they've worked with the translation of what they see, often with a mistranslation. So the best follower of Don Quixote, of Cervantes, is not another Spanish writer of that era, but Sterne, writing in England. And the best follower of Sterne, who understands what Sterne is doing, his life, is Gogol in Russia. So through translation, through these, and so there's a way, one has to have confidence so that an audience and people you're writing to need to and want to make sense of what is presented to them and make the imaginative leaps. And not try to think, well, I have to think on behalf of the audience. The audience is there trying to grasp the fragments, the different things, and where there's a gap. It's like when you don't understand, you half understand a language, and people are talking, you miss a word. If you miss too many, you just retreat, but otherwise you're actively involved in leaping over those. This could be that, this could be, and I think that's the connection where art gets its most life from. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but it's the direction I would go. And to emphasize also for me, the vital part of collaboration, yes, more and more as I go on. So. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for the ONS team for the organization, and thank you both for the meeting. So I'm gonna told you two questions. I'm a photographic artist, and since 2021 I've been working with a biologist to learn about a specific type of symbiosis between an orchid flower and fungi at their roots. So symbiosis is a relational modality defining a mutual beneficial and sustainable interspecific relationship. Okay. I believe that borders are the place where this world meet, and in this sense they are a fertile refuge for the diversity of life. I've noticed that sometimes when we carry out research that it's totally local, but still, let's say, open, it can resonate with others elsewhere. The biologists I work with and who carry out this research come from a naturalist tradition, which means that they maintain a, let's say, particular style of attention to things, of listening, of observation, which accept a form of emotional involvement with which they work consciously, and which is therefore not a matter of naive projection. Today, it seems to me that this style of knowledge, it's marginalized. Sorry for my English, but I'm trying to improve myself. Okay, and it's devaluated because it's a knowledge that includes the body, the senses. I have the impression that the styles of knowledge that are in the majority today are styles of knowledge that deanimate, let's say, yeah, the world. Okay, thanks. I think that there is a primordial poetic of the living. And as Audre Lorde tells us, poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence. Poetry is the way we help give name to the nameless so it can be thought. For there are no new ideas. There are only new ways of making them felt. So, being part of a doctoral program based on artistic practice, I would like to know if you think that poetic, empathy, physical and emotional aspects of an inquiry are increasingly valued as singular form of knowledge and maybe understanding and transformation, and in what lies their value. And sorry, it's very long, but I have a second question. So, about Donna Haraway's work, Isabelle Stenger say, "Tell me how you tell a story, and I will tell you what you are building." William, in your last discussion with Judith at Berkeley, you say that in your work, the narrative structure of struggling kept an open-endedness that one, allow the unpredictable, and two, give agency to the living. With an open-endedness, that condition of struggling push you into the sense of an act of being complicit in the construction of a possible meaning. In other words, the link between things is no longer of the order of therefore, consequently, but rather of the order of in spite of, surprisingly, etc. You speak about stupidity, the fact that the piece is always more clever than the artist, from the Dada and the surrealism that creates, let's say, insoluble objects. I underwent that realistic images are not realist because they imitate surfaces, like univocal illustration, but in the way that they resist any process of description or naming. They restore a rhythm, a vitality proper to the real. So, do you think that these images involving struggle, contradiction, tension, these complex images, are ways of restoring a vitality proper to the world? Thank you.
Okay. Do I think that the images of contradiction and paradox are a way of restoring vitality to the world? No, I don't think they can have that immediate action. They can show, they work metaphorically in the same way that work with biologists or scientists artists are not scientists, but what we hope to get from science are the metaphors that exist. So, for example, in string theory and in cosmology, you have an idea of the black hole, and you have the idea of strings of information circling a black hole. And the scientists will work out the maths and the proper relations. But what it suggests to an artist is that there, even with these deep scientists, what are they talking about? They're talking about everyone's black hole, the grave we're all going to reach. And then the question which the scientists have about, is all knowledge lost in a black hole, or does it exist in some form in the strings that circle of information that circle the black hole, is really a debate about, is death the end? Is there nothing left? Or can we not accept that we have to believe there is some kind of a soul, some trace of people that isn't lost and gone? So for me, the interest as an artist is not the deep science, but the metaphors released by the deep science that connect to things outside that way of working. So the idea of hybridity obviously takes us back to surrealism, to combining a fish's head onto a human body, to the exquisite, le corps exquisite, the exquisite bodies of the surrealist games of saying we are not single, we are multiple, we have many selves, many centers. And so I would say what an image does is the same way work to someone, to show a possible way of thinking, and in that way change the person looking at it, who may then change the world, but it's not going to have people out on the street because they have seen this hybrid image. Or it might, but not the kind of images that I imagine. There are certain songs that make you want to go and burn down the post office.
Yes, maybe my response is along those lines. First of all, thank you both for your enormously thoughtful questions. There's a lot in both of them that we could discuss for quite some time. So I apologize for the brevity of my response. I guess the question is, are we living in a time, or do we share a sense that we are living in a time where becoming deadened is the greatest threat, and that the re-enlivening of the senses is the most important accomplishment? And does that re-enlivening of the senses happen through aesthetic experience, and in particular, does it happen through poetry, and if so, what features, right? So these are all crucial questions. My worry, and I know Frédéric has addressed this issue in his own work, is that maybe the problem is that we feel all too vital about all the wrong things. Like hatred can be just a fabulously vital experience, or apparently killing can. We see that in contemporary wars where there are celebrations after atrocities are committed. Why are they singing? Well, why are they dancing? Why is there exhilaration after a bombing or something like that? What has happened that our passions are enlivened in that way? Or in the United States, Trump will say something against migrants and people will scream with happiness. They feel alive for the first time in a long time. So aliveness itself is not sufficient. We actually have to figure out under what conditions and in what forms we are feeling alive and why it has come to that. So, there has to be some sort of critical questions asked, as I know that Frédéric has also suggested, about vitalism, which is why critical vitalism is different from vitalism per se. How that would work in relationship to poetic aliveness is another, or poetic vitality, to use your word, I think is another question, and an interesting one.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We can maybe take a couple of questions more, if you want to raise your hands. Yeah. Brief questions, please.
I didn't write 10 page. So I'm an old beach. I have to present myself, and she. So my question is a bit parésia. It's a bit difficult. So I take the risk to. I understand the needs, more than the needs. I'm a accomplice in these works, to make visible the barbaric situation of the apartheid regime amongst so many others. But did you question, William, it's a difficult question, don't take it personally. Did you question the right to be the spokesperson, the spokesartist, to take the voice? Who is talking, could say Lacan, to take the voice, the word, as a charcoal stick, at the place of the people who suffer directly of the situation. In that black exploitation, spoliation, in the substitution, where you are using a kind of technique which is coming from the Western expressionism, did you substitute your whiteness in South Africa? I was living in Soweto, in Orlando in '94, so the period of the transition. So that's why it's affecting me to ask this question. So how could you be your spokesman, the spokes artist of the barbaric situation? And don't you spoil the people who are supposed to take the voice, to talk about, to take the injustice as a practice?
Yes, thank you. It's a question that's been often posed, and it's a kind of obvious one. It's an irritating one, but it's a fair question. No, firstly, to say I am the spokesman of it is false. There are many artists whose work is seen from South Africa, black and white. So I'm a view. The perspective of the images of the films is always that of a white viewer looking at them. I don't claim to be the victims. It's always a perspective from someone who is complicit in the images that are seen, which is my own. It's not possible. I'm not a novelist. A novelist, and a good novelist who can, and a great novelist, can put themselves into other people and inhabit other worlds and show the world from that place. There's a falseness to think that simply because you come from a painful, oppressed background, you are necessarily the best describer, representative, artist of it. A bad poet will be a bad poet, whether they've lived through the experience or not. So I think that's a false dichotomy and question, to put it that way. But the perspective is very much from myself, however limited you want to do it. A white male, a white cis male, Jewish, almost 70-year-old now. All of those perspectives are built into the identity, which is the eye looking and making it. And there's no apology for that. There's no way I can. I mean, that's who I am. I can't pretend, as you say, to be another person. There's a complicated question of the use of other people's pain in images. But that, I would suggest, is a fundamental condition of art making. We are always taking someone else's experience, even if it's a person next to you, even if it's the remembrance of your own pain. It's a construction. It's a using of material that can be done. So the ethics of that is less pressing to me than it is to many other people. But certainly to feel I have to be the sole representative of what happened in South Africa is both an unfair responsibility and something I certainly couldn't claim to do.
I have a question for William. I'm very impressed with your work, especially the work about the trees, about the mothers, and but my question is, why the trees? Why it's a memory for the lost mother? And I wonder the ideas for you and also for Professor Butler.
Well, the trees came first. The trees came first. I was making drawings of trees, and then at a certain point I thought these have an element of almost like being portraits of people. The way they stand like a... And so when it came to the section of the drawing of the memory, that's where the two things came together. It was as much as I understood how memory works, those branching of synapses, which then becomes a tree, and that made me think, maybe I've been drawing not my mother, but different people in these.
My
these
question can be, my question can be why it is the lost mother, not father.
Oh, okay. I'll tell you. One of the things is easy. My father is not lost. He's still alive, living in London, and my mother died 7 years ago. And my father comes into the series. I talk about my father a lot in the film, and my mother less so. So, both of those reasons.
That's so sweet to call me madame. No, it's interesting, right? Because I could be professor, something like that. But today, where was I? I was monsieur all day. It was like, wow, what's going on? I had no idea. There's the cap. I don't know. Look, I think we always grasp one thing through another thing, especially when it's gone, right? So where are the traces of the lost mother, right? It can be in the sound that maybe is like the sound of those shoes, or it might be in the living tree as it moves, but also will eventually also perish. And I think that it could be in a box or a smell. And I think Proust tells us this. He says, where do we find loss? Where do we find it? He says, in the bladder of leaves. So leaves as they move and rustle and make some kind of sound, that's the lost other. And I think it's almost always beside the vivid representation, in part because it allows for the association, and in part because the vivid representation tends to fail, right? It freezes the image, or it monumentalizes. It doesn't let it move. But there is a movement in metonymy that allows us to actually feel in a way that we might not be able to with a proper image. There might be something radically improper about grieving that we should accept. We all do it improperly, by the way.
Professor Butler, you ended the discussion with a kind of exhortation to use the materials and the resources we have as intellectuals, as academics, to fight for justice. And I thought I wanted to bring that home to a point that was touched on obliquely here, is the conflict in Gaza right now, which is interesting because your country and mine is, of course, enabling, funding this genocide and ethnic cleansing. South Africa brought the case of genocide to the ICJ. And in the comparisons, of course, with apartheid ought to be apparent, but are often controversial. So I wonder what concretely are the actions we can take? What is the responsibility of intellectuals vis-a-vis this hugely important issue right now?
And what country is yours?
United States.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you're speaking to Kentridge as his country and yours.
Oh, sorry. I meant you're American, right?
I think I still am.
Okay.
Yes.
I meant your country and mine.
I'm thinking about leaving.
Yeah. Me too. And then South Africa, of course, bringing the case to the ICJ. So our country funding the genocide, ethnic cleansing, ICJ, bringing the case to South Africa bringing the case to the ICJ.
Well, I found the case before the ICJ that South Africa offered to be just enormously moving and extremely important. There are people who are saying maybe they're making a false analogy, but I think they know the law very well, and that the case against the Israeli state is a strong one. And I think it's right to use the word genocide to describe the acts that have taken place and are taking place still. I think there are many ways of approaching this question, but I will say that for many Jewish people, especially Jewish people who whose families did bear the losses from the Nazi genocide, as my family does, it is extremely important and heartbreaking, I would add, to bring the case against Israel. But we have to remember that anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism are two sides of the same coin, right? I grew up thinking, oh, Jews don't do things like that. Jews are good people. No, we wouldn't colonize people. We wouldn't do this. We wouldn't do that. Well, we also shouldn't be essentialized. Like, oh, we're just colonizers, or we just commit atrocities too. No, we've suffered horrible things and we've done horrible things, like many other people in the world. So, these are delicate conversations, and I'm happy to have them if the mayor's office would let me speak. I think that there will be an opportunity for me to speak in March on this issue. We'll find a non-city funded location to do that. But I would like to see more calm and careful historical, political, legal, and ethical discussion on this issue. I was telling William before that I was sent a series of poems from Gaza about 2 weeks ago, and they were last will and testaments. And I thought, oh, how am I supposed to read these? And also, how am I supposed to write a paragraph that introduces them? Had no idea how to do any of that. But what struck me in the midst of the anger, the sorrow, the ineffable grief, the deep, deep feeling that these poets in Gaza felt of being abandoned by the world, was also an affirmation of life and a set of imagery, again, that was surprising to me. The continuing articulation of a wish for those who will survive to live and to live well and to tell stories and to play with balloons and to remember their games and to keep joy in their life. And it was really an astonishing act, this act of writing. And they were each poems, for sure. They were supposed to be last will and testament. But of course, if you've lost everything, there's nothing to give away. And if you don't know who's surviving you, there's no one to whom to give something. But then that becomes the predicament, and the poem emerges precisely when the form of the last will and testament becomes impossible. I hope you will see them. They will be out in the next weeks on ebook. Anyway, that's my meandering response to your comment. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think we need to close now. Thank you for this very urgent and poignant conversation. I would like also to take a moment to thank, and I switch to French deliberately, de remercier l'ensemble des équipes techniques de l'ENS qui ont rendu ce rendez-vous possible, le service de la communication, de la logistique, la direction. I also want to give you all like 2 others rendezvous, first in February and March for Judith lectures on grief here at the ENS. You can find all the info on the République des savoirs website, and at the Centre Pompidou in April for the Judith Butler Fest. Thank you all, and thank you to all these guests. Thank you.